Five, four, three, two, one.
All right, hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa. It's time for the Army's Inquisition yet again, episode 179 on Sunday the 11th of April. I'm Amish Philippe.
I'm Amish Ben.
I'm Amish Matt.
And tonight we've got an author, senior lecturer in international history, Dr. Jonathan Colman, joining us on the podcast. How are you, Jonathan?
Very well, thank you.
It's good to have you. You tend to specialise in a lot of sort of modern history, I believe.
Yeah, I tend to focus on American history, particularly Cold War history. So, American foreign policy and British foreign policy. And one of my modules is about the Kennedy administration. So they're my sort of interest, basically, Cold War history. And
you were saying in our emails that's particularly relevant at the moment because it's coming up to the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion.
The 60th anniversary.
60th even.
So, time moves on. Absolutely, yeah. So there's still loads of interest in JFK, and he came into office 60 years ago, and it's pretty much almost exactly the 60th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs disaster.
Now, for people of our generation and also this side of the pond, the Bay of Pigs invasion is probably not very well known, so maybe we should start there and tell us all about it, really.
Yeah, quite a story, really, but where to start?
This is a problem with history, isn't it? Because everything's sort of connected.
If we start in 1959, for example, Cuba was taken over by Fidel Castro and his colleagues, and initially he developed a kind of mixed relationship with the United States. But as he moved more towards the Soviet Union, this being the Cold War, the Americans began to take more and more of a dislike to him. And what it meant basically was that the President Eisenhower, who left office at the beginning of 1961, he developed plans to overthrow Fidel Castro. And JFK inherited those plans, and he put them into action in April 1961. And what those plans entailed was a so-called covert or secret operation, secretly sponsored by the United States, whereby a group of Cuban emigres, that is, people who left Cuba with Castro coming to power, would launch an assault on Cuba, and it was thought that would help precipitate Castro's downfall, and for the Americans, they'd be rid of a thorn in their side.
So how was sort of Castro's popularity in Cuba at this time? Because they obviously thought that they could foment some sort of coup or revolution. Was he a divisive figure at this point in history?
I think the Americans miscalculated. One of the things they had in mind was, if this invasion force established a so-called beachhead in Cuba, and waged guerrilla warfare from the mountains or wherever, that would generate a rebellion within Cuba to do away with Castro. In reality, Castro was quite a popular figure. There are Gallup polls from that period, or polls of some type or other, which suggested it was very, very well regarded. So the Americans were too optimistic, I think, in expecting that Castro or the Cuban people want to overthrow his government.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite books is Memoirs of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, and that goes into a lot of these foreign policy interventions of the US in Central and South America. And again, it's these covert means of regime change and whatnot.
Yeah.
How did it actually work, the Bay of Pigs? What was the sort of the mechanics?
Well, what happened was that from the time from 1960, when Eisenhower was still in operation, in office, the United States began training a group of Cuban emigres who, as I said, they'd left Cuba with Castro coming to power. And they were being trained up for a paramilitary operation, which was put into effect in April 1961 when JFK was in office. And as you say, the idea was that it will bring about a regime change. And it was classed as a covert operation in the sense that the United States wanted to conceal its role in training and supporting the emigres. So the US was involved all the way through, but particularly JFK was very keen to avoid the United States being known for sponsoring the operations, because that would obviously be very controversial.
Absolutely. Now these emigres, were they handpicked? Were they ideologically opposed to Castro, or were they just paid like mercenaries or whatever? What was the motivation for these guys to take part?
There are different perspectives on them. Castro himself, he described them as mercenaries, but the impression we have is that they represented a cross-section of Cuban society. So these were people with a range of reasons for opposing Castro. I mean, some, for example, they would have suffered economically from Castro coming to power and nationalizing farms and so forth. Others, they're simply hostile to his politics, his socialism, and how he began to embrace the Soviet Union. So they're quite a diverse bunch, basically. Although Castro, he tended to describe them as, in class-based terms, as rich men and members of the lumpen proletariat and so forth. But as I say, they're quite a diverse bunch. So they had individual reasons for wanting to reclaim Cuba, as they saw it, and do away with Castro.
Was there any evidence for these chaps being promised senior leadership roles if it was successful? That's an old trick that governments use.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about that, really. I'm sure they had in mind, securing, prominent roles in a newly established government of Cuba, but exactly what the Americans said to them, I'm not absolutely sure. But I say they had their own motivations for wanting to do away with Castro. Some simply saw themselves as Cuban patriots. They saw Castro as being kind of an alien force, not representing the Cuban people, and so on.
I suppose it's just sort of difficult because obviously this was sort of classified, and I guess you're reliant on, is it sort of fairly recently declassified documents that shed more light on this?
Yeah. I mean, most of the documents that were produced around the time, they tended, this is a general thing, they tend to become available maybe 30 or so years after the event. So, from the 1990s onwards, people had the opportunity to get a full picture of what went on the American side. So I think most of the documentary material has been released, but there's probably still a certain amount that pertains to the activities of the CIA, for example, in that era, and perhaps about the military role of the United States, because, as I say, the United States was providing military support and backing for the Cuban emigres. But at this stage, we have a very, very clear sense of what went on, certainly on the American side of things.
How many invaders are we talking about? And were they shipped off? Were they sort of in US warships sailing across, or how did it work?
There are about 1,400 of them. So if you consider the size of Cuba, it had a population of 7 million or so. So it's pretty, in terms of them launching an effective invasion, maybe comparable to D-Day in the Second World War, it simply wasn't going to happen. But as I say, the thinking was that the presence of these individuals, they'd launched their amphibious operation with the support of the United States, and they'd establish a so-called beachhead or lodgement in Cuba. They'd wage guerrilla warfare. And as I say, the population of Cuba will be inspired to overthrow Fidel Castro. So in terms of numbers, they were insignificant, particularly when you remember that the Cuban regime had an army of, 200,000 or whatever it was. So they were definitely outnumbered.
That's a big standing army for such a small country, I would think. 200,000?
Yes, I mean, don't quote me on the figures, but the point is the invaders were substantially outnumbered. I mean, they fought very well in terms of their numbers, and Castro's forces, they suffered more casualties proportionally than did the invaders. But 1,400 or so men, they were not likely to have any real impact other than, as was hoped, the idea that the Cuban people would rise up and overthrow Fidel Castro.
Did Castro have any forewarning? Did he get any intelligence from Russia that this was going to be taking place?
I'm not too sure about intelligence from Russia. There probably was some, but the fact that this quite a substantial number of people were being trained up, and they're being trained in Guatemala with American support, it was pretty much an open secret. I mean, the idea of a covert operation is that obviously it remains secret, or at least the sponsors of the operation, their role does not become apparent. But the larger scale of the operation, the more difficult it is to to maintain that covert or secret quality of it. And there's no doubt about it. Of the hundreds or more these Cuban emigres being trained up, eventually 1,400, as I say, they were probably well infiltrated by Cuban intelligence. So it was pretty clear to Castro and his colleagues that something was on the horizon. In fact, there were intimations in the American press that something was going on. So the main point is that Castro was expecting some form of action against his country.
And what's the reason for training him in Guatemala? Would that be because it couldn't be seen to be happening on US soil?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Americans were keen to conceal their role as far as possible. Guatemala was an American ally. In fact, in 1954, the United States had been responsible for a successful example of regime change. So the CIA had been involved there and brought down a certain leader, and they put in place a government that was more friendly to the United States. So, the Americans wanted to keep as much distance as possible from, the attack on Cuba.
And so, how long did the conflict last? Were they all wiped out?
No, it lasted a matter of days. They weren't wiped out. I think the emigres, maybe about 100 or more were killed, but the majority of them, they were captured, and in fact, they're treated in quite poorly. But they were, at the end of 1962, a deal was done to enable their release. So the Americans provided X millions of dollars worth of medical supplies towards Cuba. So Cuba was short of medical supplies, and their release. But they had a very hard time in captivity from the time of their capture through to their eventual release.
Yeah.
So did all this, happen right at the beginning of the Kennedy administration? Was it sort of like one of his first acts in office?
Yeah. So Kennedy became president in January 1961, and it inherited the main plans from the Eisenhower administration for this overthrow of Castro, or what was hoped would be the overthrow of Castro. He was very much a novice president at that stage. So the operation took place, of course, in April 1961, still finding his feet. And perhaps if he'd been a more experienced president, perhaps had more confidence in his abilities, he'd have called it off, not least because, Castro was well aware that something was on the horizon. So it was kind of a devastating blow for JFK's confidence early on in his presidency.
Where's the pressure coming from on JFK to go ahead with these plans, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. There are several sources, and one of the main ones is that the fact that in the election campaign in 1961, the Cold War was obviously a big issue. You know, this was the height of the Soviet-American Cold War. Cuba, of course, had been drawn into the Soviet orbit. And what happened in relation to Cuba was that Kennedy criticized the Eisenhower administration. And remember, it was Richard Nixon, vice president, who was running against JFK. And he criticized the administration for allowing Cuba to fall into the hands of Castro and then to drift into the Soviet orbit. So the point really is that JFK, in a sense, he painted himself into a corner on Cuba. So, he issued all this rhetoric about the need to deal with Cuba, criticized Eisenhower and Nixon for not doing anything, apparently. And as such, he was placing pressure on himself, in a way, to deal with the Cuban issue. So that's one source of pressure. There was the other source of pressure was the Central Intelligence Agency. So the late 50s, early 60s was the CIA's peak of influence. It had succeeded in a number of supposedly covert actions in places like Iran and Guatemala. And JFK had confidence in the CIA, and it worked very hard and very successfully to sell JFK on the idea that the plans to get rid of Castro would succeed. I mean, JFK had his doubts. He had severe doubts about the merit of going ahead, but the CIA gave him confidence that the operation would succeed.
I think, was it Eisenhower in his leaving speech talked about the power of the military-industrial complex?
Yes, that's right. That's quite important. I don't think he was criticizing the CIA at that stage. He was talking more about perhaps politicians, senators, representatives, in areas where the defense industry was well represented. He was talking about the lobbying activities of the defense industry. But the CIA, we can certainly regard that as being part of the military-industrial complex. And, of course, its image, in part because of its activities in the 50s and 60s, was quite a sinister one.
Yeah, I suppose that encompasses the Department for Defense and all the sort of state-run bodies as well. They all have an interest in foreign interventions and whatnot. But I guess the rationale is, look, we've got this looming threat of communism, and if we don't nip these things in the bud early, we end up with a situation like Cuba, where 50 miles off the coast we have and then that led to the Cuban missile. Well, it was sort of the prophecy was fulfilled, wasn't it, with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, one of the concerns, about the need apparently to get rid of Castro, and this was raised by Robert F. Kennedy early in 1961, was that if Castro began or continued to develop his ties with the Soviet Union, then potentially Cuba could be turned into a missile base. So that was one concern. So the concern about Cuba, as I say, drifting further into the communist orbit. And as you say, Cuba, not far off the coast of the United States. Historically, Cuba had been under American control. Latin America, more broadly, was dominated by the United States. And, the fact that a communist power had suddenly emerged off the doorstep of the United States was a major embarrassment to the American government.
I mean, how did that happen? How did Russia become so influential on the island of Cuba?
Well, in large part, the Americans created that opportunity for the Soviet Union. So when Castro came to power in 1959, he had kind of mixed feelings about the United States. The United States had mixed feelings about him. But what he did was to take certain measures which upset the Americans. So, for example, he nationalized many American-owned businesses. He paid compensation, but it was only a nominal amount. He was responsible for executing many of the supporters of Batista, the dictator who'd been in power for quite a while. And this is one thing that the Americans complained about a lot. They were concerned that he never held free elections, or he never held popular elections in Cuba. And in a sense, Castro was shooting himself in the foot there, because had he held elections, he was very popular at the time, he'd probably have been, received a mandate from the Cuban people, right. And the Americans wouldn't have been able to criticize him so much. But the Americans, they responded to Castro with a range of measures which were intended to put pressure on him and show their disapproval. For example, the Eisenhower government or administration cancelled American sugar purchases from Cuba, so the Cuban economy was reliant on the export of sugar, and that creates an opportunity for the Soviet Union to set in. So initially the Soviets, they engineered a trade deal with Cuba, and as American hostility became more and more apparent, then that provided more of an opening for the Soviet Union. In fact, it's notable that Khrushchev and Castro, initially they had mutual reservations. So the Soviets thought that Castro would simply be another a typical Latin American dictator. Castro was concerned that by embracing the Soviet Union, that would compromise Cuban independence. So what we can say is that American pressure on Cuba and obvious measures of American hostility, they brought the Soviet Union and Cuba together. So the American policy was counterproductive.
Yeah, sort of economic sanctions. And,
absolutely, yeah.
And sort of Castro's obviously shown some, what would the word be? He's shown some signs of socialist policies and ideologies, and Russia have sort of taken advantage of that. And
yeah, pretty much so. Yeah. On the American side, there's some uncertainty about how far Castro was a communist. Certainly a socialist, no doubt about that. But he only kind of embraced communism fully after the Bay of Pigs episode. So that was a critical episode in pushing Cuba into the communist orbit. So again, it was definitely counterproductive from the American point of view.
Well, he got the not having free and fair elections part right.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, how does this sort of link? What was happening? Because we've got is it about 6 to 12 month gap between Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis? What's sort of happening in the meantime?
Well, we can draw a line, I think, between the Bay of Pigs episode and the Cuban Missile Crisis. What the Bay of Pigs demonstrated for the Cubans was that the Americans were they sponsored this invasion which hadn't come off, and Castro was very concerned that the United States would launch an invasion itself, that is, using American troops to depose the Castro government. So this is one of the factors that pushed the Soviet Union and Cuba closer together after the Bay of Pigs crisis. And in particular, Cuba was thinking about how to strengthen its defenses.
Right.
And so it looked to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union began providing military supplies. It began stationing troops on Cuba. And what happened in the summer of 1960 was that Khrushchev asked Castro about the possibility of placing nuclear weapons on Cuba. So Castro said yes. So he was concerned in part about the need to defend his country from another American assault. And those missiles were stationed on Cuba, and the result, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. So there's definitely a line to be drawn between the Bay of Pigs episode and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Do you think it surprised Castro? Put the frighteners on him a bit? The audacity of the invasion?
I think so. It created more of a sense of insecurity on Castro's part. And definitely the picture is of, the more the United States intensified its hostility towards Cuba, the more Cuba embraced the Soviet Union. So American policies were definitely pushing Castro into or in the wrong direction. And again, to show that American policies were counterproductive, after the Bay of Pigs crisis, Castro's government, his grip on power was cemented because he now had more reason to point to an external enemy trying to bring down Cuba. So he kind of entrenched himself in power even more forcefully than he had done previously.
Do you think that his personal grip on power was the only thing holding him back from sort of embracing America, having elections, and what would have been his fears about embracing America in that way, do you think?
Well, although Castro sort of came out, if you will, as a communist in, when was it, 61 or 62, he was also a Cuban nationalist, and he was well aware of the history of Cuba. He was well aware of how Cuba had been pretty much run by the United States from 1900 or so through to the end of the Batista regime. So he was very much anti-American, and he was, say, a Cuban nationalist, and it just wouldn't work for him to embrace the United States. Certainly could have done more to preserve better relations with the United States. It probably would have been in his interest to do so, but he was fundamentally hostile to the US. So as I say, he'd seen how the United States had turned Cuba into, JFK described Havana as being an American brothel, for example. So the United States had dominated Cuba, and Castro greatly resented that, and he resented the United States. So he was anti-American from the outset.
Yeah, so Cuba had only recently sort of had the grip from the US relinquished, and it was sort of more of a fear of US imperialism in the region, and that they would lose their independence again and be too dependent on the United States.
Yes, absolutely. So the Americans, they had the so-called Monroe Doctrine, and that was the idea that they pretty much had the right to run Latin America, and particularly the Caribbean area, as they saw fit. So Castro, very, very conscious of that. And, he could have done a bit more to get along with the Americans. Probably would have been wise for him to do that, but he just wasn't inclined to do that at all.
Well, I've heard rumours about this, but have you found any evidence for other assassination attempts on Castro?
Well, the Americans did put in place various measures to try to assassinate him. After the Bay of Pigs, JFK and RFK, obviously JFK's brother, they had a particular dislike of him, and various steps were.
Okay, it wasn't his fault, was it?
No, but there was a program called Operation Mongoose. So the CIA was involved in trying to implement various measures that would weaken the Cuban government, and there were various assassination measures included in Operation Mongoose. So the CIA was involved in assassinations, or at least had plans for various assassinations in different places in the world in the 50s and 1960s. And Castro was very much on the hit list.
Were there any actual attempts, though, or attempts gone wrong? Or?
There are all sorts of crazy ideas about how to do away with Castro. So it's really fanciful stuff. So there was the idea that the idea of poisoning his wetsuit, for example. So he put on his wetsuit before he went swimming, and this poison would get into his bloodstream, and that would kill him. And there are various other quite far-fetched ideas for assassinating Castro. But JFK and Robert F. Kennedy, they're definitely all for the idea of doing away with him. They had a very personal dislike of Castro.
Right. So Castro, they took it personal because, I mean, my initial thought is if you take Castro out, someone else is just going to slip into his shoes, and you won't be any better off. But it was personal, you think, between JFK and Castro?
Absolutely, yeah. I think Robert F. Kennedy was a driving force in America's policy towards Cuba after the Bay of Pigs. And I think he had a particular hostility towards Castro. But yeah, as you say, if you do away with a foreign leader and your role in that assassination becomes known, then it doesn't look very good for you, for your government. And there's also the problem that if Castro was assassinated, then simply one of his associates would become the Cuban president, and Castro himself would become a martyr. So that would simply consolidate the regime.
Exactly, yeah, and again push them further into the arms of the Ruskies.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there were people who argue that. I mean, there are CIA analyses which, they note the fact that if Castro died or was removed, to use the euphemism of the day, then that would simply make him into a martyr, and that would in turn entrench the regime. But let's say Robert F. Kennedy and JFK, John F. Kennedy, they had a very personal hostility towards Castro.
You know, one thing that strikes me about the Bay of Pigs is that it seems like such a blunt weapon to use. I would always imagine the USA and the CIA being far more sophisticated and having plants close to the regime and in and around the regime, and with communication methods, and trying to destabilize things very subtly over it and playing the long game, over a long period of time and doing it that way. That's what strikes me about this. It's such a gung-ho sort of thing to try and do.
Yeah, definitely a blunt tool. The US had been successful in previous instances in using or sponsoring supposedly covert paramilitary operations. I mentioned Guatemala earlier, and that turned out really well for the US. So there was that example for them to look towards. And looking back, it does seem like a blunt tool. But the point is that paramilitary operations had been successful for the United States. And the idea was that, a replay of the situation in Guatemala could, take place in relation to Cuba. And, after doing away with Castro through that mechanism, then everyone would live happily ever after.
And would they have thought that there was time constraints as well at that time, and that this threat was looming quite thick and fast, and that maybe we don't have time to infiltrate over the long term? We need to do something more precipitously. Yes, yeah, I'd say so. I think one of JFK's concerns was that the more time went by, the more Castro was able to consolidate his hold on power. So it was really a case of now or never for the US. Really, JFK he could have had an excuse to call it off because, as I mentioned earlier, the knowledge that a major operation was on the horizon was pretty well known, so perhaps he could have used that as an excuse. But there was this general sense that Castro was becoming stronger by the day, and as such he had to be disposed of sooner rather than later. What was the fallout in the US when all this came to light? What was the reaction from, politically, from the general public, etc.? It was quite strange.
the Cuban emigres and people representing the Cuban emigres, they condemned JFK for not providing more support. So one of the reasons it's argued why the operation did not succeed was that JFK, he tried to conceal the American hand by reducing the amount of American military support. So he was condemned by so-called Cuban patriots. Within the United States, among the American people in general, it's very strange, but JFK's popularity actually rose after the event. Not what we'd expect, but there was a famous press conference where JFK took responsibility. So he said something to the effect that defeat is an orphan. I am the responsible officer of the American government and so on. So he took personal responsibility for that. So within a week or two, his popularity was at an all-time high. And I think he made some comment to the effect that the worse I do, the more popular I become. So it's definitely not what you'd expect, but JFK took personal responsibility, and people admired that. I think there's a sense as well that, with him being a new president, then it's kind of a youthful indiscretion. He's still finding his feet in office. And, it boosted his popularity.
I think there's a lesson there for modern politicians, that if you just fess up and admit your mistakes and have a bit of humility, it goes a long way.
Absolutely, yeah.
We all know our leaders are only human. Well, we think most of them are human. And, people make mistakes. Yeah,
it worked well for JFK, but... it's very interesting. If you look at the transcript of the press conference, the conference where he said, I'm responsible for what went on, the press was kept on pushing about the Bay of Pigs operation, and it was trying to evade the issue, but finally he got a grip and said, I'm responsible, and people like that. But if you see the full press conference, he's trying to fob them off and change the subject. But finally he got around to admitting, taking responsibility for how things had unfolded. But as I say, the American people and people abroad, also outside the communist bloc, seem to admire him for that.
Was there any UK involvement in this operation?
No, not extensive. Certainly wasn't involved in providing support for the Cuban emigres. In fact, Britain and the United States, they did not see entirely eye to eye over Cuba. One of the concerns in this period was that Britain, being hard up, wanted to continue trading with Cuba, and the Americans were putting pressure on their allies to end trade with Cuba. So, the British weren't involved. I don't know how far they were kept informed of what was going on by the American government. The British were more involved in various ways in the missile crisis, but really they were just observers of the Bay of Pigs episode.
Yeah, because a lot's talked about this special relationship that we have as two countries, and it makes you wonder just how cooperative it is. And I mean, we've spoken to some people who believe that the UK is more powerful in that relationship than maybe some people would believe. When it comes to soft power and ideology and political power. But there's no involvement in the Bay of Pigs.
No, they might have had an indirect involvement in the sense of providing reports about what was going on within Cuba, because what happened in 1960 was that the United States ended diplomatic relations with Cuba.
Right.
And what that meant was that the Americans did not have any, they did not have, obviously, any officials based in Cuba, and they were less able to get a sense of how things were going for Castro. So the British, I think, were very helpful in providing diplomatic reports, maybe intelligence reports, explain the domestic situation within Cuba. I'm not aware of them, any of those reports, for example, encouraging the Bay of Pigs attack on Cuba, but the British probably did provide some help in respect of providing intelligence data.
Right, so the British would have had embassies, would they, in Cuba at the time?
Absolutely, that's right. And that remained the case, of course, during the Cuban missile crisis. So Britain was there with its embassy, its diplomats, maybe an MI6 presence, providing reports to the Americans of the domestic situation within Cuba.
And I'm guessing you talked about the trade. I'm guessing there will have been commercial interests and word and hearsay through commercial bodies that might have been filtered through security services back to the US as well. If we were trading quite
Yes.
actively with Cuba at the time, maybe?
Absolutely, yeah. I've never seen any intelligence material that actually relates to that, but it's very plausible to say that if Britain had people traveling to Cuba to do a deal to sell them tractors or whatever it was, then it's likely that maybe MI6 and British diplomats would take an interest in what those businessmen learned dealing with Castro or whoever, and their reports might well end up in intelligence material, which in turn might end up in the hands of the United States. So Britain had more kind of eyes and ears, if you will, in Cuba than had the United States.
And what about Russia at this point? What was sort of the Russian involvement in Cuba at this time? Were they heavily involved? Is this too early? Is it before they were sort of pushed into the arms of Russia?
Well, I think in the previous year or so, the Soviets had sent a trade delegation to Cuba. It's hard to say, really. I don't know how many Cuban diplomats, for example, were present in Cuba around the time of the Bay of Pigs attack. But certainly the Cuban relationship, Cuban-Soviet ties really increased after the Bay of Pigs. Although, the Russians were working hard to cultivate Castro, despite having certain reservations about him. And, they definitely were developing their relationship, but the speed of that relationship developing was accelerated by the Bay of Pigs.
Is it harder to get information on Russian involvement? Because I know we talked about CIA documents being declassified, and we have things like freedom of information requests and what have you. Is it more opaque when it comes to trying to figure out what Russian involvement was at that time?
Yeah, there's a certain amount of material that is available. So with the ending of the Cold War, the Soviet Union made its archive or opened its archives up. But no, we know a lot less about Soviet policies than we do about American policies. Russia is quite touchy about releasing sensitive material, and the United States, to its credit, tends to be a lot more open than pretty much most, if not all, other countries across the globe. So we always have a strong picture of the American side of any kind of major international history or foreign policy issue, far less so with countries like the Soviet Union. But there is material available. Khrushchev's memoirs, for example, were released quite a while ago, and they're pretty useful.
Yeah.
Has there been anything particularly astonishing or sort of particularly interesting that's kind of been declassified in recent years that you've come across?
The main revelations, really, certainly on the Soviet side, are to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, when the Cold War ended, it was learned that the Soviet Union had nearly 50,000 troops in Cuba. And the Americans they'd estimated that the Soviet Union simply had 4,000 or 5,000 troops there. So what that meant was that if the United States had invaded Cuba, for the Cuban during the Cuban Missile Crisis, then American troops would have encountered nearly 50,000 Soviet troops. So that's quite a miscalculation. We learned as well that the Soviet Union had tactical nuclear weapons on Cuba. So tactical nuclear weapons are battlefield nuclear weapons. We're all familiar with the sort of bombs that destroy cities and countries. But tactical nuclear weapons, they're less destructive, but very, very destructive compared to conventional weapons. So they're using artillery, for example. And again, what it meant was that if the United States invaded Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a strong possibility of those tactical nuclear weapons being used.
Mm-hmm. So the other question I was sort of thinking about as well was, I suppose, what stopped a full-scale invasion of Cuba? You know, at the point of the Bay of Pigs when they knew things were kind of going wrong? Because vaguely I can kind of think back, and was there not sort of US naval ships off the coast and things as part of that?
That's right, yeah. So the US Navy was off the Cuban coast. It was there to provide support for the invaders. But what JFK was concerned about is that if American troops, you know, they got involved, I think he said something like, "Oh, it's going to be like Hungary. It's going to be an effing slaughter." So I was looking back to the example of Budapest, 1956, where the Soviet forces crushed a rebellion in Hungary, and I think there are arguments which suggest that the CIA sponsors of the Bay of Pigs operation anticipated that if things went sour, then JFK would think, well, we've no choice but to send in the Marines. But that's one line he would not cross.
Right, okay. So there's no way you kind of send US troops onto Cuban soil?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right,
yep.
Okay. And then the other thing as well was, what do you think, I suppose, continues to be of interest about Kennedy and his sort of brief? Because did he make it through half of his term? Was it, I think, or slightly more?
He managed about 1,000 days or so. Right. It's like 2 or 3 years, but there's still loads of interest in JFK, as I can kind of testify through running an undergraduate module about his presidency. But he was definitely an important president in 3 respects. He was important in domestic politics in the sense that he was the first American president to have to deal head-on with the issue of civil rights. Mm-hmm. So, you know, you had various developments such as, you know, freedom rides in 1961 through to, the violence in Birmingham, Alabama in 63. He proposed a civil rights bill to submit to Congress. So he dealt with that issue, which is an issue that continues to resurface. Mm-hmm. He was very important in foreign policy terms. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in particular was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. So we noted, you know, some of the reasons why it was dangerous, the fact that the Soviet Union had tactical nuclear weapons there, and, you know, the nuclear threshold could have been crossed fairly easily, I think. Yeah. So it's important from that point of view. And it's also important in the sense that he is the first American president to attach a great deal of importance to image. So JFK had a very carefully cultivated public image, and a lot of effort went into constructing that image and maintaining it. So he was definitely an important president, and I think people they like to hear about the darker side of the Kennedy administration. So it's all the ladies wandering in and out of the White House.
Well, that's what was good. Just came to my mind then, where you're sort of talking about him carefully cultivating his image. Is, you know, the actual truth behind that, when you kind of look behind the curtain, as it will, about sort of all the different women, you know, who are kind of coming and going. And is there not a sister that was lobotomized or something like that?
That's right. Yeah. Yes, he had a younger sister who had she had learning difficulties, and she was, they say, lobotomized. It's quite a tragic aspect of, you know, Kennedy's family life. So I think she died pretty young as well. But to say, she simply had learning difficulties. But one of the procedures of the day was this very brutal operation called a lobotomy. and she suffered because of that. And one of the overlooked aspects of JFK's presidency was how he very sympathetic to people with disabilities of one kind or another, and that's something that people they tend not to appreciate. So it had a real empathy for people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Was it not also JFK who started the space race, or the ambition to get a man on the moon?
Yes, absolutely. So it's notable for that, and there's a Bay of Pigs connection with that, because just before the Bay of Pigs attack, the Soviet Union had put the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, and that was a tremendous propaganda breakthrough for the Soviet Union. So Gagarin was, a very charismatic individual. So he toured Britain, for example, a great unofficial ambassador for the Soviet Union, and this being the Cold War, putting a man in space was seen as having major military implications, and JFK was determined to catch up. And it's no coincidence, in fact, that shortly after the Bay of Pigs fiasco had come to an end, he announced his commitment to putting a man on the moon. So JFK is very much associated with the space race and the successful Apollo mission in 1969.
Even though he didn't see it come to fruition, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah, and it's slightly misleading as well, because we talk about the space race and the race to the moon, but the Soviet Union was not really competing in that particular aspect of the space race. So Khrushchev said, well, we've no intention of putting human beings on the moon, because, what's the point? We send machines to do the same thing. They can come back with samples and so on. So maybe the term space race is slightly misleading, but JFK is associated with, obviously the successful moon landing in 1969.
It's quite interesting you have that difference between Khrushchev being the pragmatic, what's in it for us to put a man in space, whereas JFK's talking more idealistically about putting a man on the moon. It's, again, what we're going to do, or we're going to bring some moon rock back, but it's more about idealism and ambition.
Absolutely, yeah.
And proving you're the best,
Absolutely. It was all down to Cold War propaganda. I mean, JFK, he didn't know much about science or space. Initially, he had the idea of sending a man to Mars, and the scientists said, that's too difficult. Let's stick with the moon. But yeah, he was only concerned with the propaganda advantage of that, and there are documents which suggest that documents released from the administration which indicate how far the administration saw the space race as being part of the Cold War competition. So there's a concern really with winning over opinion in the Third World, for example, the post-colonial world, parts of Africa and Asia and so on. And it was all about impressing other countries. So it's all about propaganda rather than any practical advantage that might come from placing a man on the moon.
This is something that really interests me about the Cold War, in that it's rooted in ideology and propaganda and perception almost, rather than might makes right or a physical confrontation. It's who's going to be the first to the moon, who's got the biggest nuclear bomb, who's got the Tsar bomber. Was it called Ben, the Tsar bomb?
Yeah.
And
it was very much about prestige, and from the American point of view, it's about credibility. So, I mean, for example, when Lyndon Johnson started sending American troops to fight in Vietnam in 1965, one of his concerns was with American credibility in the Cold War. So it was all about how the United States would look in the eyes of its enemies. Would it be seen as honoring commitments and standing up for its allies and so on, and how the United States would look in the eyes of its allies as well. So credibility and prestige, they're critical components of the Cold War.
Jonathan, do you think the Cold War ever ended?
Well, it ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. I mean, there are people who argue that there's some kind of Cold War in place today, given the hostility between Russia and the West. The tensions that are around at the moment, they don't have the same quality if quality is the right word, that were in place really during the Cold War, because it had the ideological dimension. So the Cold War was very much an ideological contest. The United States had its vision of how the world should look, so liberal, democratic, capitalist, and the Soviet Union, of course, had its own vision of how the world should look. So, yeah, the Cold War ended really in an American triumph in 1991.
The fall of the Berlin Wall, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the winding up of communism from East Europe, and eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact themselves.
Can you not make the argument that ideological aspect of the Cold War does have continuity? It's just that maybe the players have changed. Well,
the communism versus capitalism element is it's not really there anymore. I mean, what would perhaps have is a more traditional geopolitical competition between the United States and Western countries and Russia today. But yeah, the ideological tensions are simply not there.
Right. And I guess it's less immediate. There's not this sort of, I mean, we didn't live through it, but from what we hear from people who did and from news reports is that there was just constant impending doom that the world could end, in what was it, the 3-minute warning or the 7-minute warning? I can't remember.
Yeah, 3-minute warning, but 3-minute warning. The Cold War, I mean, it's described as being the Cold War, but definitely a very frightening time for people because, to go back to the JFK era, in 1961, there were concerns about nuclear war breaking out over Berlin. Oh. And, of course, in 1962, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and there were various other episodes which created very real concerns about the possibility of nuclear war breaking out. I mean, there is the argument that the Cold War was cold because of the presence of nuclear weapons. And the argument is that, both sides were too scared of a nuclear war to do anything too dangerous. But at the same time, the Cold War was definitely very hot in poorer parts of the world. So we're aware of conflicts, for example, in Korea, for example, Vietnam, the Middle East, and so on. So
Afghanistan.
Was a frightening time.
Yeah, it was more sort of a global proxy war, it seems, and that, like you mentioned, those conflicts like Korea and Afghanistan and whatever, going right up to into the 80s. And and that again seems to be something that we maybe have a slight hangover today when you look at what's happening in Syria and so forth. That we tend to, because we have such powerful militaries and military might and the threat of nuclear weapons, that we seem to be seeing these sort of proxy wars being fought. Proxy war is a very good way of understanding the Cold War. A good book came out a few years ago, and it's called The Cold War's Killing Fields, and it talks about these numerous conflicts in the poorer parts of the world, and it questions the idea that the Cold War was a Cold War. Absolutely, because the superpowers were so frightened of a direct conflict between them. It's argued that stabilized the situation. It led them to pull back from the brink on various occasions. Nonetheless, the war was fought in other forms using proxies in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and all over the place. When you think about it, it's quite, insensitive is maybe the wrong word, but it's quite disrespectful to call it the Cold War. We only call it the Cold War because it wasn't happening on our doorstep, where actually it was happening, like you said, in developing countries across the world. And, we were just lucky that we didn't catch get the full brunt of it in that sense. Yeah,
I agree with that. The term Cold War is misleading because millions of people across the world died because of the Cold War in conflicts. It's also quite a strange phrase in the sense that people talk about periods of détente, when tensions eased, and that's the idea that the Cold War thawed. But at the same time, people talk about the Cold War becoming a hot war. So is it good that the Cold War warmed up, or is it a bad thing? So it is quite a strange idea.
A tepid war.
But I think it is disrespectful because it misleads people. They think, okay, the Soviet Union did not fight directly with the United States. Britain was not, there was no nuclear war. Nonetheless, it was a war, and it had major effects on people's lives across the world.
And not to mention just the military actions, but also he talked about economic sanctions and such that were done for purposes of the Cold War, for ideological reasons that have real effects on real people. And we often not discount, but forget about those sort of consequences of these non-hot wars, if you like.
Yes, yeah. So we're talking about Cuba and American measures. So the United States, this is an example, engaged in various measures of economic sabotage. So what they did was, they took various steps to weaken, farming, for example, in Cuba. Likewise, they did similar things in North Vietnam and what have you. And those sort of activities, they're not just about weakening a government or bringing down a regime. They cause misery for ordinary people. So sabotaging sugar supplies and so on, it creates real hardship for people.
Yeah, like Agent Orange in Vietnam. And it's like, it reminds me of siege warfare going back thousands of years and starving people out. I mean, it's so inhumane. You just hope that stuff like that isn't going on today, but I wouldn't know. But
yeah, it's interesting that, in fact, that in the Bay of Pigs attack, the United States, the Cuban emigres, which were supplied by the United States, used napalm, which you might be familiar with, really horrible weapon that was used in Vietnam and elsewhere. Agent Orange used in Vietnam from the Kennedy period onwards, and people are living with the consequences of it. So Agent Orange obviously caused severe ecological destruction and still has major effects on people's health. So the Cold War, its effects were overwhelmingly negative.
Well, we've gone over an hour already, Jonathan.
Right.
I've got to ask you one thing before we go, though, because we've been talking about JFK so much. What's your take on his assassination? Because there's been so many books written about what happened.
It's interesting that Lyndon B. Johnson said that Castro was behind it. I don't really buy that. I mean, but Johnson's thinking was that, Kennedy had been trying to bump off Castro, and Castro, succeeded in bumping off JFK. I don't buy that really, because I don't think there's any hostility from Castro towards JFK as an individual, and Cuba didn't really have the reach to do that sort of thing. So I like to keep things simple, and I go with the theory that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone assassin and there was no conspiracy.
On that bombshell, the CIA gets another let off.
Keep things simple.
Well, what's the? I was going to say the sword of Damocles. No, it's Occam's razor.
Yes, absolutely.
Not the sword of Damocles. Anyway, hey, we'll let you go, Jonathan. Stay on the line for us while we play ourselves out. It's been fascinating and great talking to you. And
pleasure to speak to you.
Excellent. Right, don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a flash. Right, then we're back.
The dwarf, the cripple, and the mother of madness.
That was our chat with Dr. Jonathan Colman.